Good morning and welcome to Carnegie Endowment's events on Global Perspectives. My name is Amr Hamzawy. I'm the director of the Middle East program, and I'm joined by my colleague and friend, Nathan Brown, with whom I've been working to address the growing, unfolding crisis in the Middle East following October 7th. Last year. I'm going to hand it over to Nathan to introduce our guests. We're joined by four of our colleagues and friends and contributors to a Governing Gaza compendium that just came out from the Carnegie Endowment, looking at Israeli, Palestinian, regional, and international debates. Nathan, over to you.
Thanks very much, Amr, and thanks to everybody for joining. The compendium, the Gaza compendium, which Amr just made reference to, is really fascinating and wide-ranging series of analyses of debates in various fora, and those are what we're here to discuss today with four of the leading contributors to that. The compendium is fascinating and rich. The times are dramatic and I think in many ways discouraging. Things seem to be moving quickly, but it's not clear where and how deeply things are changing with what kind of effect. So that's what we're going to be analyzing from several angles. The theme of polarization isn't new. Within some of the societies, and Israeli society was deeply polarized before October 7th. Palestinian society dramatically split between the West Bank and Gaza. America, one of the leading actors in deeply polarized society. But there's a level of polarization as well at the global level. I mean, even to refer to what is going on, was October 7th the beginning, or was it merely an inflection point? Is this a war in Gaza or the war on Gaza? Basic vocabulary changes when you change forum, and to try and sort of keep this in mind as we understand what is likely to happen is very, very difficult. There are lively debates within various societies. Those lively debates are sometimes elements of those do filter outside of the society, so people are aware of what's going on. But sometimes it seems to be, when I'm reading analyses of debates in one setting, they have unrealistic expectations or understanding of what is going on elsewhere. So the idea here is just to get four analysts together. And they actually asked them to do something a little bit unusual, not simply present their own analysis, but present how they see debates in the societies or the forum which they are most familiar. So I'm just going to introduce them very briefly. You can find their bios on the Carnegie website if you don't know them already. First, we're going to be hearing from Jonathan Rynhold, who's at Bar-Ilan University. Then we'll be hearing from Zaha Hassan, who's at Carnegie Endowment. Then we'll be hearing from Yasmine Farouk, who's also with Carnegie Endowment, and then with Muriel Asseburg, who's from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And what I'm just going to ask each of them to do, Jonathan focusing on Israel, Zaha on Palestine, Yasmine on the region, and Muriel on the entire world, to talk about just, while some of the basic positions of various actors are clear, what fundamental or long-lasting changes they see within the policy arena, the policy debates that take place in those various settings. So we'll ask each of them to speak briefly. We hope that there'll be time for discussion and for questions afterwards. So let me just turn things over quickly to Jonathan. What do you see changing sort of permanently as a result of debates among Israelis about what is going on right now?
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you for inviting me. I was very intrigued by your question about long-term changes, because it reminded me of three remarks that really explain where Israel is. The first is of Henry Kissinger: Israel has no foreign policy, only domestic politics. The second is the former British Prime Minister Harold Wilson, who said a week is a long time in politics. And the third is Moshe Dayan, who said Israel has no foreign policy, only a defense policy with international implications. And what I'm really trying to say by bringing those three things together is I'm going to agree with President Biden, who speaks of this as an inflection point for the region. In other words, I think we are at a point where the road can go in different directions. We can take different turnings. I think that for Israel, that junction is mainly domestic. If there is an election, we will have a different government, and it cannot be more right-wing than this one. It will be more centrist, and that will be very significant. There is a chance that that government may come sooner than many people think, because there is today there was a major change in the stance internally within the coalition, and there will be a Supreme Court ruling at the end of March. So the coalition may well come apart. But as we said, a week is a long time, so Israel might be at war with Hezbollah by then. And therefore, it is very, very difficult to speak of long-run changes. So what I'm going to try and do is talk about how Israelis frame what's going on in the policy debate. And I think that that framing will remain very, very strong as we move forward. So for many people outside of the region, we talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israelis would see that as very 1990s. In other words, a time at which the US was all-powerful, and the states and the powers in the region that would have opposed peace, Iran, Iraq, and Libya, for example, Hamas was just beginning, were weak. So you could talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as an island, almost. But, you know, for almost 20 years, Israelis see a regional conflict, and Gaza and the Palestinians are part of that. And I would identify it as an axis that wishes to smash the regional order with violence, that is united by a hostility to rights, individual rights, democracy, and free societies. It's very divided. It's many divisions and many competitions, but it's united on those two things. And on the other side, those who want to protect, expand, and reform the current order in the Middle East through normalization in part of relations between Israel and the Gulf states. And for the Arab part of those allies, I think their direction of travel is modernity and a freer society. I mean, it's a low starting point, but that's the direction. And when it comes to Israel, we are at an inflection point. There's no other way of putting it. Domestically, in many ways, despite the screaming and shouting, Israel has moved in that direction underneath, inside its society. So, for example, my own university used to have, 10 years ago, about 1% Arab students. It's now about 14%. And there are about 20% of Israeli citizens Arab, or however you want to describe them. So what does that mean for Gaza? What it means is that while you have a radical right that does see these things primarily in Israeli-Palestinian terms and what settlements in Gaza and all the rest of it, they are extremely weak unless Netanyahu is in power, because he can't be in power without them. If he is not in power and there is any other government, they will lose a lot of power, and they will be a spoiler, but they will not be in the driving seat. So we're left with two versions of what could be. One I would call the mainstream right, which used to believe that it was possible to ignore the Palestinians and thereby jump straight to the Abraham Accords. It's very clear that that's no longer tenable, because their way of dealing with the Palestinian issue, which was to manage it and keep the Palestinians divided and support Hamas in certain ways, that's just no longer tenable. Nobody in the Israeli public is going to buy that. And the way they look at Gaza is they want a technocratic government. Contrary to what you read, they don't really want a long occupation. What they would really like is something like Area B in the West Bank, which would be Israeli security, overall security control, and Palestinian local security control. But what they really expect is chaos. They have certain illusions about a role that Egypt and the Gulf states would play without any horizon for the Palestinians. So that's more or less who they are. But one should understand that within the coalition, one of the largest parties without which they wouldn't have a majority is Shas. And Aryeh Deri, who's one of the most important people in Israeli politics, when it comes to the Palestinian issue, is much more a member of the center or even the center left. So how did the center or the center left look at it? Well, they would look very much to the security establishment. And the security establishment believes that if Israel can topple Hamas from being the governors of Gaza, and if they can break Hamas as an army, then there is a huge opportunity here to improve things both for Israel and for the Palestinians. But it depends on defeating Hamas. Now, there is no illusions that you can defeat an idea with force, but you can defeat a force and thereby deter other actors from attacking Israel or seeing the model presented by Hamas as one to be replicated. So without Hamas, there would be an opportunity for a different type of Palestinian authority on the model of Salam Fayyad. Salam Fayyad is the only Palestinian leader to ever successfully do the following: not be corrupt, improve the rule of law, improve the economy, and all of this under the legitimate mantle of the Palestinian Authority. He failed because he couldn't compete with the political and military power of Fatah in the West Bank, which would not exist in Gaza. There is therefore an opportunity. It's very clear that Israel would have to do its bit, because it's not enough to be functional. You also need to be legitimate, and that requires being seen to be patriotic. And therefore, Israel's role in this would be expanding, making that horizon for a Palestinian state credible. And that would involve not only statements, which Israel's traditionally very good at, but actually changing the situation on the ground. And the easiest and most practical and thing that Israel can do that can make a difference is expand Area B in the West Bank. That is, 40% of the West Bank is currently under Palestinian civilian control. It is possible to expand that in the first instance, perhaps by 11%, which is just symbolic, but that's significant. It's possible to do it because you don't need to move any settlers and you don't have to take any security risks. And given the level of hawkishness among the Israeli public, much more than that is not possible in the medium term. Looking more broadly, the goal of the center would be to tie that into a regional piece along the lines that the administration in the United States sees things, in the hope that the Axis thinks in very long terms. That is, they don't mind if they don't destroy Israel today. They can wait 50 years, no problem, as long as it happens. The alternative vision of the Allies has to be one that stretches beyond the normal horizon of politics in the West, and has to be long-term, and has to be thought of as presenting a vision of Arab politics and Islam that is authentic and legitimate and moderate. And Israel's role is to help facilitate that. It's a fraught process, but I don't see any better alternative. And Israelis right now are without hope. They see a very, very dark future. And I think that it's hard for people to live without hope for long. And that is why I allow myself to hope that the current mood in Israel will shift.
Thank you very much. I mean, you actually touched on regional dimensions. So we'll hear from Yasmine on that, some global actors like the United States. We'll hear from Muriel. But first, Palestine. Presumably, debates are a little bit different among Palestinians. Can you fill us in?
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. And thank you to you and to Ahmed for putting together a very interesting compendium and for organizing this event today. I want to distinguish in my remarks between developments from within Palestinian civil society and those that are occurring at the political level. The developments at the societal level are significant, I think, while those at the political level, I would argue, are likely to be less so. October 7th and its aftermath have been more of an accelerant of existing trend lines for Palestinian civil society rather than a change in the direction of travel. On the political level, the developments are more about resurrecting ideas from the past and dusting them off than about really changing the existing dynamics. At the societal level, the developments I see taking place relate to three areas. First is how Palestinians feel about coexistence with Israelis and how they understand resistance. Second is how they understand the priorities of this moment with regard to their leadership structures and governance. And third is how Palestinians understand their resilience and steadfastness on the land since October 7th and their reliance on international donor support. On the first point concerning coexistence versus resistance, October 7th really changed the notion in the minds of many Palestinians that there can be peaceful coexistence with Israelis, whether that be in a two-state situation or as equals in one state. Palestinians have taken note of the fact that most Israelis are not disturbed by the fact that a likely genocide is taking place in Gaza for 4 months now. They see Israeli polling that suggests more Jewish Israelis prefer a continuation of the war over a deal to release the Israeli hostages held in Gaza. They also understand that most Israelis prefer Palestinians to be held without rights or expelled, and they oppose even a demilitarized state of Palestine as a political solution. The events of the last few months have impacted the thinking among even the most moderate Palestinians, I would say, or those who were the biggest advocates of one binational state for Jews and Palestinians. At least for now, there is a sense that coexistence isn't possible. How long this feeling persists and what the implications will be to getting to a political solution later on isn't clear. What we do know is that support for armed resistance has risen after October 7th. A poll conducted by Khalil Shikaki in both the West Bank and Gaza at the end of November and into early December showed support for armed resistance rose from 54% before October 7th to 68%. Support for forming armed groups for defense against violent settlers in the West Bank also rose and is now a clear majority. And when Palestinians were asked about the best way to establish an independent state, 63% answered that armed struggle was the best way. But that's only part of the picture. Civil society in Palestine still very much supports nonviolent resistance as well. A majority support diplomatic initiatives at the UN and elsewhere. The ICJ cases, in particular, the case regarding the illegality of Israel's prolonged military occupation, has given a lot of people hope. Almost 40% of Palestinians in the occupied territories also, support civil disobedience and direct action. Palestinians have a long history with this, dating back to before the creation of the State of Israel. Protests, strikes, civil disobedience were at the apex during the first Intifada. The situation on the ground has changed a lot, though. We now have a very fragmented West Bank, in addition to the cutoff between the West Bank and Gaza. Organizing is therefore much more difficult than it would have been in 1987 when the first Intifada began. And there's also new tracking and surveillance technologies on phones and mounted in public spaces that scan faces. So it's a very different environment for civil disobedience today. And of course, there are more checkpoints and roadblocks all over the West Bank. And a lot has gone up since October 7th. New barriers and gates have gone up around Palestinian communities. Civil disobedience also requires some belief that you can shock the conscience of the other side, or at least of world public opinion, so that you can provoke a change in the behavior of the other side. In 2018 to 2019, Palestinians in Gaza organized large nonviolent protests to challenge the Israeli blockade and siege over the Strip. More than 200 unarmed Palestinians were killed by sniper fire, and thousands more were injured or permanently maimed. The outrage over the shootings of the nonviolent protesters at that time did not change Israeli policies or the view of Israelis about the nature of its occupation over Palestinians. And since October 7th, the world has been able to see what's been unfolding in Gaza in real time on social media platforms. To date, we reached over 30,000 Palestinians killed. 3 more children died today of starvation, and 104 people were killed by Israeli fire when they approached a truck delivering humanitarian supplies. So Gaza has yet to shock the conscience of policymakers, though it has shocked many Americans and international civil society. Whether Palestinian nonviolent protest and civil disobedience would provoke change in the near term seems unlikely to me. That civil disobedience and the images out of Gaza don't make policymakers want to move really is discouraging to the idea that you're going to see more civil disobedience, and it's going to argue in favor of seeing probably more violent resistance. On the question of Palestinians and how they understand their national cause, their national institutions, and governance in Palestine, I'd say before October 7th, the main debate among Palestinians in the occupied territories was around PA governance, how to make it better, more representative, more inclusive, and more in line with Palestinian security priorities. Palestinians wanted PA elections for both the parliament and the presidency, which they hoped could also lead to national reconciliation and a revitalization of the PLO. October 7th has made PA renewal less of a priority. Elections seem even more impossible now, and external actors have little interest in helping to ensure that they do happen, given that they can't be assured of the outcomes. So the debate is much more squarely about how to rebuild the PLO so that it can assume its traditional role as the vehicle for Palestinian self-determination and an end of the ongoing displacement and rights violations. There is more interest today among Palestinians, both inside the occupied territories and in the diaspora, in creating a mechanism for rebuilding the PLO, whatever that looks like, whether that's citizen assemblies or some kind of national dialogue that would help get to a place where we could start to think about a new PLO. It's unclear now, but those conversations are happening. On the subject of Palestinian resilience versus reliance on donors, after October 7th, it became very urgent for Palestinians to think about their reliance on donor funding and to explore alternative sources and mechanisms. This is for a lot of reasons. First, Palestinian civil society can't count on donor funding. For years now, a campaign has been going on to shut down all effective civil society organizations in Palestine that challenge the Israeli occupation, the settlement enterprise, or encourage Palestinians to remain on the land. These organizations have been smeared as terrorist organizations, and they have been designated by Israel. They've had their offices raided, equipment taken, staff detained and abused. And after October 7th, donor countries became even more reticent about supporting Palestinian civil society because of the legal risks associated with these unsubstantiated terrorism labels. So Palestinian civil society is really important to keeping Palestinians on the land, and they were there before Oslo, before the creation of the Palestinian Authority, but they've also been important with the institutions that came with the Palestinian Authority, because of the fact that Palestinian Authority has had uneven capacity over the years, and because it hasn't prioritized the same things that civil society has. So the civil society plays a very important role, but it's hamstrung by donor aid that is off and on or contingent. But you're starting to see now, particularly after the situation with UNRWA, where UNRWA aid has been suspended, again, on claims that some of its staff were involved in October 7th. There was a lot of concern about how that aid, humanitarian assistance, became weaponized in that context. And so the conversations around civil society today are about, how can Palestinian civil society move away from donor aid to other mechanisms for support, whether that be outside of Palestine from diaspora sources, or self-help measures that can be taken internally to get away from this kind of dependency. Now, I don't know how, where this is going to go. The need is so great in Palestine and the challenges are enormous, but this conversation is one that I'm hearing a lot now. And just quickly to the political level, the developments there, I say, are less groundbreaking, but I think it holds sort of a moment of truth for the Palestinian Authority and the idea of a two-state solution. Before October 7th, the PA was struggling on many levels. It had lost its purpose and legitimacy. It had, lack of capacity in terms of its starvation from funds, from revenues that Israel collects on its behalf. It was impotent of the last few years to do anything about the regular Israeli military incursions into the West Bank, where the PA was supposed to have exclusive jurisdiction. 2023 was the deadliest year for Palestinians before October 7th. 4,000 Palestinians.
I hate to break in on such a negative note, but can you wrap up? I'm not going to tell you to come up with a happy ending, but yeah.
Yeah, no. So, what I will say about the Palestinian Authority is, there's a lot of talk about revitalization. That might be, the saving grace for the PA, and this talk of a two-state solution will give it new purpose. But the reality is the challenges that face the Palestinian Authority before October 7th continue today, and there doesn't seem to be a political will to change the dynamics with Israel and encourage it to change course in terms of its policies. We haven't seen that kind of engagement from the U.S. yet, and I don't expect that we will. So not much fundamental change, although there's a lot of reemerging talk about a two-state solution and revitalizing the PA. I guess I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, interestingly, Jonathan began sort of talking about how Israelis see things in a regional context. Regional context seemed to be a lot less prominent in when you were speaking, probably for understandable reasons. Let's now turn to Yasmine and see how it's a time of incredibly active regional diplomacy. What's likely to be the long-term outcome, you think?
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very glad to be always to be with my other Carnegie colleagues. So I would highlight three actually of what I see as long-term trends that are actually linked, the three of them among themselves. The first one is that, from a very pragmatic perspective in the region right now for the different countries and the different diplomacies, there is the perception that this conflict is still an obstacle to the regional security and stability, that they want to make their, even to fulfill the interests of their own national security or even their national development plans, if you want to talk about the Gulf countries. Before October 7th and before this war, what we know a lot about this region is that nobody cares about the Palestinians, that, the normative attachment to the Palestinian cause, whether on the regime's level or on the people's level, is no longer there. What I am saying is actually not contradicting this. It is just that this Palestinian question is back from a results-oriented, pragmatic point of view. It has shown that the spillover across the region, the transnational spillover in society that threatens radicalization, that threatens domestic stability in different countries, that threaten plans for, Middle East corridors, for normalizations, for shipping in the Red Sea, for development plans across waterways, are all threatened. So when Arab countries today, including, those who are leading on the file, be it Jordan, Egypt, of course with caveats, but Gulf countries say that we want a long-term solution. They are not saying it like the older leaders would say it from a normative and emotional point of view sometimes. It's from a very pragmatic point of view. They want to hamper their plans, whether strategic, economic, military plans for the region, but also for them to become an international hub when it comes to Gulf countries. So that's a long-term consideration to keep in mind when analyzing their discourse and their steps towards not necessarily a solution, but at least avoiding an eruption, another extremely violent eruption of this conflict. This applies to their diplomacies and the ways that different Arab countries are willing to intervene in the solution or the path towards a solution. So, for example, if you come to Gulf countries, if you take a country like Saudi Arabia, for example, or even the United Arab Emirates, you know, a lot of analysis before October 7th would use the indicator of they no longer fund the Palestinian Authority as they used to, or contributions to UNRWA. The new perspective on the conflict that I'm talking about means that it is not that they are not willing to fund, as they told the Israelis, we're not going to clean up your mess. They would fund, but they would invest in a long-term stabilization of this conflict, if not a solution of the conflict. So it's not that they don't want to, they're not going to use their financial leverage. It is just that they are looking for a better allocation and a better use of the financial leverage that would serve their own interest on the long term. So when, I don't know if you saw just today, for example, there was an article about the Arab proposal for the group of Arab countries that are proposing a peace plan. This is precisely the large framework of it, is that, okay, we're going to work and invest in a solution, but we want guarantees from the United States that there will be a certain path that guarantees that our money that is going and our diplomacy that is going into the solution is going to last on a longer term. So that's what would be my number one observation on the long trend, that we should not continue to take the narrative, the regional narrative on looking for a long-term solution, because from a pragmatic point of view, they want it. Two, I think the perception today in the region as well, if you see the different movements and the countries that are meeting to talk about this and devise the plan, you would see that, and of course from the fieldwork and the interviews, is that there is a realization that US security or defense guarantees, or even US active military action in the region, is not enough to guarantee the security of the different countries of this region, that even they could try as much as possible to dissociate themselves from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to have normalization with Israel, to have the support of, you know, a strong army, and to have defense agreements with the United States, that even this is not enough to protect them from the spillover of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that in addition to the relationship with the United States that they have that might avoid deterrence and security guarantees, they do not need détente not only among themselves, but also they do need détente with Iran, that is another actor in this conflict, that is a main actor in the spillover. So you can even you know, say that in the current context, at least for the Gulf countries, for example, the détente that they have with Iran has served them more than the strikes against the Houthis, because the strikes against the Houthis and against their attacks on the shipping in the Red Sea wouldn't have prevented the Houthis from attacking Saudi Arabia or re-attacking the United Arab Emirates if there wasn't the détente with Iran, if there wasn't the détente even with the Houthis themselves. So I think that's a second realization, that it is not enough to rely on the United States or even to have a normalization with Israel, that this kind of regional détente with Qatar, with even Turkey, with Iran is needed in times of crises. And The final thing that I would say is that you hear a lot from the region, and then I will wrap up this idea that this crisis has shown once and again, and I think many people have heard this a lot of times, that there are double standards in the application of international law. There are double standards in the application of international humanitarian law, and that the next time, Western countries are going to try to apply these to Arab countries, it will just not work. And at this moment in time, they have the support of the public opinions on it, which is something that different regimes have been playing on in the media. I'll stop there for the sake of time.
Okay, thank you very much, Yasmine. Finally, Muriel, what's going on at a global level?
Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for having me. I'm going to focus a bit on the US and Europe, not because I think others are not relevant, but due to time reasons. And I'm also going to be focusing on official politics. Again, not because I don't think that the civil society, the societal level doesn't count, it does. But the idea of global Palestine, the solidarity movement around the world with Palestinians hasn't translated so much to the official level when we speak about the US and Europe at least. Now, I think the inflection point that people have been speaking is also very, very relevant when it comes to the US and Europe, not only because of the realization of the risks that are still there of regional and international escalation of the conflict, but also of the unprecedented repercussions that we have seen around the globe of the escalation that we have seen. And also because they are so much interlinked to other conflicts, like the Russia-Ukraine conflict and Russian-Iranian cooperation in that regard. And so there is an awareness that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can no longer be ignored, it can no longer be managed, it can no longer be shrunk. And that also means that in contrast to what was the attitude over the last at least 10 years, the US and the Europeans have to want peace more than the parties themselves. So that, I think, is the one realization that has changed. So if they want to have a say and shape the path out of the cycle of violence, of occupation, of blockade, of revenge, then they need to be more active and help the parties to disentangle that. And that is reflected when we look at the principles that have been put forward by the US administration in Tokyo, by the foreign policy chief of the EU with the Borrell principles. And we see it that the way the Biden administration is trying to put together a package in cooperation with the Europeans and regional actors, trying to stabilize Gaza under a revitalized PA, trying to provide a horizon for the Palestine question in terms of a two-state approach, trying to, at least ponder the question of recognition of a Palestinian state, trying to seek agreement between Israel and Lebanon on the border, and then also for providing Israel's integration into the region, first and foremost with pursuing Israeli-Saudi normalization. Much less, I see that that aspect that Tom Friedman has been stressing so much, and that is pushing back against Iran's allies in the region. And even the attacks on Yemen, I would say, are so far very careful and hesitant. Now, what remains completely unclear to me is how much political will actually there is in the US. The will to really spend political capital, not only now, but for enough time to see the process through and to put that package not only once on the table, but trying to implement it. And I think the US is really key here because the Europeans remain so divided that we have some member states who are actors in that on certain aspects like hostage deals, mediation on medication, stuff like that. but not in a position to really pull through the whole package. So it remains with the US first and foremost. And the question is if there is enough will to basically address the major hurdles that are on the way for such a package to be realized. And I'll just want to speak about some of these hurdles. One is, of course, the vision that Prime Minister Netanyahu has put forward for Gaza and for the Palestine question in general. So these principles that he has put forward are so much in contradiction, fundamentally contradict the US and EU principles, that it is quite difficult to move forward with that plan. Not only on Gaza, but of course with regards to Palestine sovereignty or the lack thereof, the will to allow any kind of sovereignty in the mid to long term. And as Jonathan has said, I think that is not only a question of the current government, that is also a question of stances of the Israeli population, at least for the time being. The very strong feeling that this is not the time to move forwards towards any kind of Palestinian sovereignty. Second one is that I think the only security arrangements that could convince Israel to not insist on a direct military presence, on direct Israeli border control, on overall security control, on the prerogative to intervene militarily at any time, would be a US-led force. And we don't see that realizing, and I don't have any hope that that would realize. Third point is that, and we already touched on this, that there will be a continued presence of Hamas and other armed actors. They will remain veto actors that need to be dealt with. And that can be either inside or outside the framework of a technocratic government or national unity government. But in any case, that will be a major challenge for the US and the Europeans on how to deal with them. And maybe not repeat the mistakes of 2006 and the following years. Fourth point is the massive destabilization. Zaha has spoken about that, of the West Bank through the settlement project and settler violence. That is unlikely to be ended in a parallel fashion to moving towards more stability in Gaza, and will always pull Gaza back also. And of course, now looming with Ramadan, renewed strife over the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif. Fifth point is the weakened Palestinian Authority and the need for very substantial, rather than facade reform, the need for stable funding, the need for elections to move forward. All of that, not so much a priority of the US and the Europeans, at least for the time being. So the jury, I think, is still out if we really see a situation where the inflection point that has been grasped, and that is important, also leads to a renewed push, not a renewed push, but actually a fundamentally altered approach of the US and the Europeans, if the very limited time until the US election can be used effectively to put the process on track, and then if the will is there to see a process through and not only squeeze the genie a bit into the bottle until it pops out the next time. And I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you so much, Muriel, for your excellent points. And thank you, everyone, Jonathan, Zaha, and Yasmine, for your excellent remarks. You've contributed to the compendium. Your contributions are present on our website. I suggest to our audience to check the compendium out, not only Zaha's, Jonathan's, Muriel's, and Yasmine's contributions, but we have a set of 22 contributions covering Israeli debates, Palestinian perspectives, or Israeli perspectives and Palestinian debates, so Nathan is not annoyed, as well as regional and international actors. Let me, in the interest of time, we have a hard stop in around 16 minutes. Let me pose a question to each one of you. And I'm going to start with the reversed order. So I'll start with a question posed to Muriel. I will pose my 4 questions and call on each one of you to be really brief, so we can have maybe a second round and maybe include our audience. And I welcome, we welcome audience comments. You can raise your questions in the chat. So Muriel, listening to you, I'm left wondering about Europe as of now. I mean, not in a stabilization package following the ceasefire. I'm left wondering about the effectiveness of European policy tools as of now. I mean, you refer to a bit of maybe French mediation with regard to a bit of medication a couple of weeks ago. A couple of meetings happened in Paris with intelligence chiefs from Israel, Qatar, Egypt, and the US. I'm not sure, however, where Europe is, and I'm seeing a clear regression of European positions. And even in our internal discussions, we compare Europe as of today to positions taken by European countries and by the European community, followed by the EU, all the way from the Venice Declaration in the 1980s, all the way throughout the last decades. So what is happening? Is it the divisions between different countries, or is it the rise of right-wing politics in Europe which are impacting the effectiveness of European diplomacy? If you could shed light on that. Yasmine, to you, I was sort of intrigued by your remark that countries, your reference was mainly to, in the region, your reference was mainly to the Gulf countries, are interested in investing, but they would only invest if they have guarantees about long-term outcomes, stabilization, economic prosperity, security arrangements. And then you were also saying that US security arrangements do not count as much as they counted maybe in previous moments. Can you, I mean, is it a unified bloc perception that you're referring to, or do we still have differences between countries where national security is impacted more by what's happening in Israel and Palestine, Egypt and Jordan, as opposed to the Gulf countries? Can you shed some light on differences? And then you referred also to Iran and a rapprochement with Iran, stabilization with Iran. Is it how based on your field work, and I know you've been out in Saudi Arabia and different Gulf countries, is it how Gulf establishments look at it, that as long as you pacify Iran and have guarantees from Iran, it's enough for their security, or do they still need a bit more, a regional security scheme in which maybe Israel is included or Turkey is included? If you can shed light on that. To Zaha, I was interested in following on your point regarding a new PLO. And so I'm not aware of the discussions happening, but if you can shed light, especially, I mean, when I hear a new PLO, especially the way the PLO has been framed since October 7 up until now as sort of a one way out for Palestinians beyond the factionalism unfolding on the ground, that maybe one way is to revitalize the PLO, not to create a new PLO. One way is to initiate a Palestinian national dialogue in which big questions on civil disobedience, civil resistance, or armed resistance, statehood, and so on and so forth, revitalizing the PA as a tool of the PLO, actually as an executive branch of the PLO. Revitalizing the PLO has been in discussion. So you're referring to discussions about creating a different PLO, a new PLO. Can you shed some light on the dynamics, and is it feasible or not? And then finally to Jonathan, and I really appreciated your reference to the 1990s, and it's so 1990s to refer to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, I would say, however, most of what I heard you referring to is still very much 1990s. So what you're saying is basically that from within Israel, be it we're referring to formal politics and actors in formal politics or wider societal perceptions, this is pretty much still a contestation about whether to recognize Palestinian sovereignty, yes or no. I mean, the breakthrough you see maybe possible is adding 11% to Area B in the West Bank, which is, I do not need to say that would be too little. But if you could reflect on what is viable? And I'm not speaking about ceasefire, hostage deal, or ceasefire. What is viable in a medium term, sort of for the coming 2 to 4 years? What do you see viable based on the current composition of powers in Israeli politics? The rise of right-wing politics you were referring to, but then you were saying, well, but we have some centrist position on the Palestinian issue. What is viable politically, and what is viable in light of public opinion trends? So let me stop here and call on Muriel to respond first, please.
Thanks a lot, Amr. I think you're absolutely right that Europe as a body, Europe in the sense of the EU and its member states, haven't played a role and haven't been able to shape any of the dynamics in the conflict that we've witnessed over the last 4.5 months. And the main reason really is the divisions not only among member states, but also among the main people, the main representatives that speak for the EU. The president of the commission versus the foreign policy chief and the head of the council. So on basically anything relating to the conflict, they have been in contradiction and they haven't been able to find agreement on questions of weapons deliveries to Israel, on questions of a permanent ceasefire, on the question of how to deal with the accusations against the UN UNRWA, on the question of what role the case at the ICJ on genocide should play, and of course also on the question of if the EU and its member states should apply more pressure on Israel and use the instruments that they have, that are available to them.
Thank you so much. Yasmine?
As far as I remember from both of your questions, the first one is the differences between the different countries. I would put it this way. When Egypt and Jordan deal with the Palestinian issue, with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they really don't have a choice. Their policies are dictated by immediate national security concerns that are sometimes linked to their survival, right? Gulf countries have choices. They have more leeway on how much and how long to engage in this conflict or not. I guess that, as my first remark alluded to, is that they have realized that the conflict needs to be on their agenda more than it was before when designing normalization with Israel, when designing regional economic and strategic projects, when thinking about the relationship with Iran, with the United States. But they still have a choice on how much they want to engage and how much time they want to be committed to it. And in very practical time and in very practical terms, and as was highlighted in my contribution, they didn't up until this point let the war in Gaza take over their other plans or their other projects, including with Israel, including with the United States, including with European countries who are arming Israel, despite their position that more arms is not going to solve this this conflict. But they are not letting the war really stop any other progress. Egypt and Jordan, in many of the files, don't really have this choice. It is an immediate question of national security. What I meant by the US security guarantees is what I meant in my second point, is that they all want US security guarantees. And when it comes, for example, the case that is the most mentioned is the case of Saudi Arabia, is the case of the question, which is really a fake focus in this conflict, with on the Israeli-Saudi normalization, as if it's going to put an end to all this by magic. Yes, the Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries are still interested in normalization because it brings more US engagement into the region. But now they are at a point where they realize that even this is not enough. So they want it while having a regional detente with Iran, because also they cannot control US actions in the region. The US targeting of the Houthis came at a point where when Saudi Arabia was seeking peace with the Houthis. And to your second point about Iran, very, very briefly, are these countries today looking for a regional security framework? I think it's too early to talk about that. They are coordinating in a way that is very different from the past years, especially, but coordination is still not necessarily cooperation. So I think we're still in a wait and see mode. There's definitely progress when it comes to discussing regional issues with countries that were foes a few months ago.
Great. Thank you so much, Yasmine. Over to you, Zahan. We have a question from the audience, which you might like to address on Arab countries and how they could contribute to Palestinian reconciliation talks, as well as to Palestinian stabilization, be it in Gaza or in the West Bank. Over to you, Zahan.
Okay, thanks. Really briefly, because I know we are so short now. On this idea of a new PLO, I was more referring to how you could reimagine the structures in the PLO, in particular the parliament of the PLO, which uses a very antiquated proportional representation system based off of the guerrilla factions that existed years ago, and that now the numbers have dwindled, so that there might be a few elderly men that exist in some of these factions, but to actually have elections, which is actually what is required under the PLO basic laws. But there is a younger generation of Palestinians that all they know about the PLO is that it looks a lot like the PA, and they are much more open to an idea of creating a new representative body, not having the history and not knowing sort of what went into creating the PLO and what went into getting international recognition for the PLO. So there is that challenge with a younger generation, and in particular a younger generation that lives outside of Palestine, that doesn't have much of a relationship with the PLO. On this question of how Arab states can be helpful, I think they're engaging. Obviously, Egypt has been engaging quite a bit on reconciliation. I think it's very difficult because every state in the region has their own national interests and has their own relationships with Hamas, and so that enters into the equation. In some respects, having somebody outside the region focus on trying to bridge the differences between Fatah and Hamas might be more helpful, so that you don't have the same hangups that we've been experiencing over the many years that Hamas and Fatah have been trying to get to reconciliation. But the challenge is really, with respect to the U.S. position on this and with respect to the Israeli position, are really what's hamstringing the possibility of seeing Fatah Hamas reconciliation. But I'll stop there so Jonathan can have
yes,
an opportunity.
Thank you so much, Zaha. Now over to you, Jonathan. Can you unmute? Jonathan, can you unmute, please?
Let's face it, Amr, the music in the 60s was a lot better than the 90s. Look, it's taken till, almost this is finished to really speak about Hamas. And if I represent for a moment Israeli society, they would say to Zaha, what are you talking about? Hamas built hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, used the aid for that, put weapons in every single person's apartment, under their children's bed. What world are you living in? So the idea that somehow bringing Hamas, whose leader in Gaza says we want to repeat the 7th of October many times, is somehow a move that is going to advance anything, let's just say my response would be considered far too moderate in any Israeli household. So really taking the 1990s point seriously, my point is that Israel sees the Palestinian conflict as part of a broader conflict, and its security is not simply about controlling this or that checkpoint. It's about the fear, grounded in reality, that there are many actors coming together who seek the destruction of the state of Israel, who are strong and who pose a serious threat, and that cannot be fully decoupled from the Palestinian question in a way that it might have been possible to do in the 1990s. So, regarding what's possible, I will try and end on a hopeful note by saying that both the Yom Kippur War in 1973 and the First Intifada that began in December 1987, the short-term reaction over a year or two was very much to harden Israeli public opinion, and it's been hardened far more this time. However, one of the main theories in peacemaking is you need a hurting stalemate and a way out. When a way out was presented by the dramatic visit of Sadat to Jerusalem, or by a complete turnaround in Palestinian politics, Israel responded. And our national anthem is the hope. So I hope that there will be a good reason for hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I'm tempted just to mute myself and everybody because you ended on a hopeful note. But I do want to just with one final comment. You said you need a hurting stalemate and a way out. We're at least a quarter of the way there. The hurt is there. Whether it's a stalemate or a way out is yet to be seen. I did hear an awful lot of actually more overlap than I expected among the presentations about sort of what's going on in the region, and probably a little bit more realistic expectations, I think, of what was going on in other parties, Israelis understanding Palestinians and Palestinians, and just a little bit better than I thought, and some creative ideas being thrown out. I'm still left with, I'll go back, Jonathan, to your question. What world are you living in? Everybody seems to be living in different worlds, and those worlds seem to be clashing in ways that the conclusion I come to after this discussion are the clashes are not going to end anytime soon. The only question is what form they will take and how long they will last. So I'm sorry to disrupt Jonathan's happy ending with a less happy one, but I really want to thank all the contributors for a really rich set of remarks, some actually fairly new and profound analysis, and to refer people who are watching to the full compendium. You can read the four authors here giving an overview, but many other views as well about what's going on among the various actors. So thanks very much to Jonathan, to Zaha, to Yasmine, to Muriel, to my friend Amr. Well, they're all my friends. And thanks very much for such a rich discussion.